I want you all to know that I am leaving. I need to do this for myself.
You really expect us to believe that you're moving?
It is happening. This is going to be interesting.
Tomorrow will explain everything.
The day I told my daughter I was leaving, she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. "Mom, where exactly are you going?" Melissa asked, shaking her head. "You're not going anywhere." My son-in-law Brian smirked from across the kitchen table. Neither of them believed I had the courage to walk away after everything. I looked around the house my late husband and I had spent 30 years building. Then I smiled and quietly said, "You'll understand tomorrow." The next morning, Melissa's laughter vanished the moment 2 moving trucks pulled into the driveway. And that was only the beginning. If you've ever felt taken for granted by the people you loved most, I'd like to hear your story. Before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe if this kind of heartfelt family story speaks to you. And in the comments, tell me how you would have reacted in my situation. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd truly love to read every response. My name is Diane Boyd, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved your family enough, they would love you back. At 68 years old, I had learned that wasn't always true. 8 years before everything fell apart, I lost my husband, Thomas. We had been married for 42 years. 42 years of building a life together. 42 years of paying mortgages, raising children, arguing over paint colors, celebrating birthdays, and dreaming about retirement. When Thomas died unexpectedly from a heart attack, I thought the worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened. I was wrong. The real heartbreak came slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice it at first. After Thomas passed away, the house became unbearably quiet. Every room carried memories. The kitchen where he used to sneak cookies before dinner. The living room where he watched football every Sunday. The porch where we'd sit together in the evenings and talk about absolutely nothing. For months, I wandered through the house like a ghost. Then Melissa called. At the time, she was going through financial problems. Her marriage to Brian was struggling. Medical bills had piled up. Their apartment lease was ending, and they had a teenage daughter, Sophie, who needed stability. "Mom," Melissa said over the phone one evening, her voice trembling, "would it be okay if we stayed with you for a little while?" I didn't hesitate. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. What mother wouldn't help her child? I remember spending 2 entire weeks preparing their rooms. I painted walls, bought new bedding, cleaned every corner of the house. I was excited. For the first time since Thomas died, I wouldn't be alone. I convinced myself that maybe this was a blessing. Maybe family living together again would heal all of us. At first, everything seemed wonderful. The house felt alive again. Sophie's laughter filled the hallways. Melissa cooked dinner some nights. Brian helped mow the lawn. We watched movies together, shared meals, talked for hours. For a brief moment, I felt needed, wanted, loved. But little things began changing. The changes were so small that they barely registered. Melissa started making decisions without asking me. She rearranged furniture, redecorated rooms, Change things Thomas and I had carefully chosen together. One day I came home from grocery shopping and found our dining room completely transformed. The antique cabinet Thomas had restored by hand had been moved to the basement. I stood there staring at the empty wall. "Melissa," I said carefully, "why did you move the cabinet?" She shrugged. It looked outdated. Outdated. That cabinet had been one of Thomas's favorite projects. I wanted to argue. Instead, I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth creating conflict. That became a habit. Not speaking up, not wanting trouble, not wanting tension. Months passed, then years. Gradually, I stopped feeling like the homeowner. I started feeling like a guest who happened to pay all the property taxes, a guest who happened to own the house, a guest who happened to clean it. The first time Melissa truly hurt me, I remember exactly where we were. We were at a grocery store. I was comparing prices on soup cans. My eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and I took a little longer reading labels. Melissa sighed loudly. "Mom, can you hurry up?" I looked up. "I'm trying." She rolled her eyes. "You take forever doing everything." The words weren't particularly cruel, but the tone was. For the first time, I heard impatience instead of affection, embarrassment instead of respect. I laughed awkwardly and moved on. But that night, I cried in my bedroom, not because of the soup cans, because something felt different, something important. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. If I forgot something, Melissa joked about my age. If I asked a question, she acted irritated. If I shared an opinion, she dismissed it. Brian rarely said anything. But silence can be just as painful as cruelty. Sometimes more painful. At least cruelty acknowledges your existence. Silence makes you invisible. The hardest part wasn't how they treated me. It was how normal it became. Every morning I woke up early, made coffee, prepared breakfast, loaded the dishwasher, cleaned counters, folded laundry, ran errands, cooked dinner. By the end of each day, I was exhausted. Yet somehow, nobody seemed to notice. Nobody said thank you. Nobody asked if I needed help. Nobody asked how I was doing. I became part of the furniture, useful, convenient, taken for granted. One evening, Sophie found me sitting alone on the back porch. The sun was setting. The sky was painted orange and gold. She sat beside me quietly. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart. You seem sad a lot lately." The honesty of her question nearly broke me. Children notice more than adults think. I forced a smile. "I'm okay." She looked unconvinced. "You don't seem okay." I reached over and squeezed her hand. At 16, Sophie was becoming a remarkable young woman. Kind, thoughtful, observant. Everything I wished her mother still was. "I'm just getting older," I said. She shook her head. "No." The answer came quickly, confidently. "You look lonely." I couldn't respond, because she was right. The loneliness wasn't caused by being alone. It was caused by being surrounded by people who no longer saw me. That realization haunted me. Weeks later, I found myself standing in the hallway outside Melissa's bedroom. The door was partially open. I could hear her talking on the phone. She was speaking to one of her friends. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply froze when I heard my name. Honestly, Melissa laughed. Without me, my mom wouldn't know how to survive. The women on the phone laughed together. Melissa continued. She depends on us for everything. I stood there in silence. The irony almost made me laugh. Depends on them. I paid the utilities. I paid the property taxes. I paid for most household repairs. I cooked meals. I maintained the house. Yet somehow, in her version of reality, I was the dependent one. That night I sat in my bedroom long after midnight. I stared at an old photograph of Thomas. It had been taken during our 25th wedding anniversary. He was smiling, his arm around my shoulders, his eyes filled with the same warmth that had carried me through decades of life. I traced my finger across the frame. Then I asked a question I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. How much longer was I willing to live like this at the time? I didn't know the answer. But for the first time in years, I had begun asking the right question. And once you start asking the right questions, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The truth was that something inside me was changing, quietly, slowly, but permanently. And neither Melissa nor Brian had any idea what was coming. If cruelty arrived all at once, most people would recognize it immediately. They would fight back. They would leave. They would protect themselves. But the worst kinds of wounds are often delivered in tiny cuts, small enough to ignore, small enough to excuse, small enough to survive. At least for a while. That was exactly how Melissa changed. Not overnight. Not dramatically. Little by little. One careless comment at a time. One eye roll at a time. One humiliating joke at a time. And before I realized it, my own daughter had become someone I barely recognized. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs wearing a floral blouse I had recently bought. It wasn't expensive, just something cheerful that had caught my eye at a department store. I was pouring coffee when Melissa walked into the kitchen. She looked at me. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. "What?" I asked. She shook her head. "Mom, you seriously bought that?" I glanced down at my blouse. I thought it was pretty. It looks like something a 90-year-old woman would wear. Brian chuckled from behind his newspaper. Not loudly, just enough. Just enough to let me know he agreed. My smile faded. I looked back at my coffee. "Oh." That was all I said. "Oh." A simple word, a small surrender, one of hundreds that would follow. The problem wasn't the blouse. The problem was that nobody defended me. Not even once. Months later, we attended a neighborhood barbecue. I was telling a story about a family vacation Thomas and I had taken years ago. Halfway through the story, I paused. For a moment, I couldn't remember the exact year. Melissa jumped in immediately. "See," she said, laughing. "Mom forgets everything these days." Several people smiled awkwardly. Someone changed the subject. And I sat there feeling smaller than I had in years. I wasn't suffering from dementia. I wasn't confused. I had simply forgotten a date, something every human being does. But Melissa had started turning normal moments into evidence that I was somehow declining. At first, I thought I was being too sensitive. Then the incidents became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I misplaced my reading glasses. I spent 15 minutes looking for them. Eventually, I found them sitting on a bookshelf. Before I could laugh at myself, Melissa spoke. "Maybe it's time we start talking about assisted living." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at her. "Excuse me," she shrugged. "I'm just saying." Brian nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing. Just enough to make me feel alone. I laughed nervously. But inside, something twisted painfully. Assisted living because I misplaced reading glasses. I knew people my age. Friends. Neighbors. Church members. Nobody talked this way to their parents. Nobody. At least not parents who were still fully capable of taking care of themselves. Yet somehow Melissa treated every normal mistake as proof that I was becoming a burden. Meanwhile, I was still the person running most of the household. I paid bills, scheduled repairs, handled insurance paperwork, managed finances, cooked meals, cleaned, organized, remembered birthdays, remembered appointments, remembered everything. But none of that seemed to matter. People only notice your strengths until they become accustomed to them. Then they start noticing only your weaknesses, or the weaknesses they imagine you have. The person I worried about most was Sophie, because she saw everything. One evening I was washing dishes after dinner. Melissa and Brian had already gone upstairs. Sophie remained at the table doing homework. After several minutes she quietly approached me. "Grandma." "Yes." She hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "I don't think what Mom says to you is okay." I froze. The water continued running. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I forced a smile. "Your mother is under a lot of stress." Sophie's expression hardened. That surprised me. She rarely challenged adults. That's not an excuse. The conviction in her voice startled me. I turned off the faucet. She continued, "You always make excuses for her." For a moment I didn't know what to say, because she was right. I always did. I always found reasons, stress, work, money, marriage, life, anything to avoid admitting the truth. The truth was simple. Melissa enjoyed feeling superior, and I had allowed it. Sophie looked down. "I hear the things she says when you're not around." A knot formed in my stomach. "What things?" She hesitated again. Then regret appeared on her face, as if she already wished she hadn't started. "Never mind." I placed a hand on hers. "No. Tell me." She swallowed hard. "Sometimes she talks about you like you're helpless." The kitchen suddenly felt colder. "How often?" Sophie's silence was answer enough. Far too often. I hugged her, and for the first time, I felt ashamed. Not because of Melissa, because my granddaughter had been forced to witness all of this. Children should never have to watch adults disrespect one another, especially family, especially mothers. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Sophie's words, helpless. The word bothered me more than it should have, because it wasn't true. I wasn't helpless. I had simply forgotten that I still had choices. The next morning, I bought a small notebook. Nothing fancy, just a plain black notebook from a drugstore. I told myself it was for organizing appointments. That was partly true, but it served another purpose. I started writing things down. Comments, conversations, dates, incidents, everything. At first, I wasn't even sure why. I just felt a growing need to keep track of reality. Maybe because Melissa had become so skilled at rewriting it. Every time she said something hurtful, I wrote it down. Every time she mocked me. Every time she dismissed me. Every time Brian silently supported her behavior. The notebook grew quickly, far quicker than I expected. 1 page became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. Reading through it was shocking. When incidents happen separately, they seem small. When they sit together on paper, patterns emerge. And the pattern was ugly, very ugly. One afternoon, while organizing old financial records in my bedroom, I accidentally left the notebook on my desk. I went downstairs to answer the door. When I returned, Melissa was standing in my room, holding it. My heart dropped. She looked amused. "What is this?" I walked forward and took it from her. "It's private." She laughed. "You've been keeping notes." I said nothing. Her smile widened. "That's weird, Mom." Weird. Not painful. Not concerning. Not a sign that something was wrong between us. Just weird. Then she added something I would never forget. "Maybe you have too much free time." I almost laughed. Too much free time. The woman who cooked their meals, cleaned their house, handled half their responsibilities. Apparently, I had too much free time. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet. The same quiet I had once feared after Thomas died. But this quiet felt different. It felt revealing, honest. For years I had been asking myself how to keep peace, how to avoid conflict, how to make everyone happy. For the first time, another question entered my mind. What if peace wasn't possible because I was the only one trying to create it? I stared at Thomas's photograph on the mantel, the same photograph I looked at whenever I felt lost. And suddenly I realized something. If Thomas were alive, he would never allow this. Never. He would be furious. Not because someone forgot to thank me. Not because of a rude comment. But because I had started believing I deserved it. The notebook remained in my lap. Its pages filled with years of evidence. Years of disrespect. Years of excuses. Years of silence. And for the first time, I began wondering whether that silence was about to end. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't know what I would do. But deep inside, a shift had begun. Small, quiet, dangerous. The kind of shift that changes everything. And soon, whether Melissa realized it or not, she was going to force me to make a choice neither of us could take back. My 68th birthday should have been a happy day. At least that's what I told myself. When Melissa announced she was planning a birthday dinner for me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not a lot. Just enough to make me believe things might finally be changing. Maybe she had noticed the distance growing between us. Maybe she wanted to reconnect. Maybe she remembered the kind of mother I used to be before life became complicated. I should have known better. 3 weeks before the dinner, Melissa became unusually enthusiastic. She called relatives, invited neighbors, even reached out to cousins I hadn't seen in years. The guest list kept growing. At first, I was touched. I told Carol over the phone that perhaps things were improving. "Maybe Melissa's trying," I said. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she asked carefully, "Has she apologized for anything?" The question caught me off guard. "No." "Has she changed how she treats you?" I hesitated. "Not really." Carol sighed softly. "Diane, sometimes people organize celebrations for themselves, not for the person they're celebrating." I didn't want to hear that. so I ignored it. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. The day of the party arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon. The house was full by 4 o'clock. Cars lined the street. Laughter filled every room. People carried gifts and desserts into the kitchen. For a few hours, I genuinely enjoyed myself. I hugged cousins, caught up with old friends, listened to stories about grandchildren and retirements. For the first time in months, I felt visible, like I mattered again. Then dinner began. And everything changed. Melissa stood at the head of the dining room table, a wine glass raised in her hand. Everyone quieted down. I expected a toast, a few kind words, maybe a memory about family. Instead, she smiled in a way that immediately made me uneasy. "You all know my mom," she began. The room chuckled politely. Living with her has definitely been an adventure. A few people laughed. I smiled uncertainly, trying to stay positive. Then she launched into a story. It was about the time I accidentally locked myself out of the house 2 years earlier. A harmless mistake. Something that had happened once. Melissa exaggerated every detail. She mimicked my voice, my confusion, my frustration. People laughed. Loudly. I forced a smile. Maybe it was just one joke. Then came another. A story about me struggling to use a new television remote. More laughter. Then another. A story about me forgetting where I parked my car at a shopping center. More laughter. Each story painted the same picture. An old woman, confused, helpless, ridiculous. I sat frozen in my chair. The room seemed smaller somehow, hotter. The sound of laughter echoed in my ears. I glanced at Brian. He was grinning. Not uncomfortable, not embarrassed, enjoying it. That hurt more than I expected. Several relatives shifted awkwardly. A few stopped laughing. But nobody interrupted. Nobody said, "That's enough." Nobody defended me. Melissa continued. "I swear," she said dramatically, "if I didn't live here, Mom would probably burn the house down trying to make toast." The room erupted again. And that was the moment something inside me cracked. Not because the joke was particularly cruel, because it wasn't. It was because I finally understood something. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was deliberate. Melissa wasn't honoring me. She was entertaining people at my expense, and she enjoyed it. I looked around the table, at faces I'd known for decades. Some looked uncomfortable, some looked amused. Most looked relieved that they weren't the target. I suddenly felt exhausted. Deeply exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes when you've been carrying pain for too long. Eventually, the speeches ended. Dinner continued. Conversations resumed, but I barely heard any of them. I spent most of the evening quietly clearing plates and cleaning dishes. My own birthday party. And somehow I was still working. At one point, Sophie entered the kitchen. She looked upset. "Grandma." I turned. She wrapped her arms around me. Unexpectedly. Tightly. "I'm sorry." I blinked. "For what?" She glanced toward the dining room. "You know." I swallowed hard, then kissed the top of her head. It's okay. But it wasn't okay. And Sophie knew it. Later that evening, guests began leaving. One by one, cars disappeared, lights dimmed. The house slowly emptied. By 10 o'clock, only Melissa, Brian, Sophie, and I remained. Melissa was still laughing about one of the stories she'd told. still proud of herself, still completely unaware of what she'd done. I helped load the dishwasher, wipe down counters, put away leftovers. No one thanked me. No one mentioned the speeches. No one asked if I was okay. Around 11 o'clock, I finally went upstairs to my bedroom. I closed the door, sat on the edge of my bed, and cried. Not dramatic sobs. Not loud tears, just quiet heartbreak. The kind nobody sees. The kind that accumulates over years. I looked over at Thomas's photograph, the same one that had become my silent companion since he died. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Then I whispered something I hadn't said aloud before. I can't keep doing this. The room felt very still, as if even the walls were listening. My phone rang. The sound startled me. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. Hello? A familiar voice responded. Diane, it's Robert Jenkins. I immediately recognized the name. Robert had been Thomas's attorney for years. Even after Thomas passed away, Robert occasionally checked in. Not often, but enough to remind me he was still there. Robert, I'm sorry for calling so late. That's all right. There was a brief pause. Then he spoke carefully. I wanted to let you know that everything has been finalized. I sat up straighter. My heartbeat quickened. For months, Robert had been helping me review old documents Thomas left behind. Property records, estate paperwork, financial protections, things I had neglected for years. Finalized, I asked. Yes, his voice carried quiet satisfaction. Every document has been updated. I closed my eyes. A strange mixture of relief and nervousness washed over me. Good. You sound tired. I laughed softly. It's been a long day. Birthday party, I was surprised he remembered. Yes. How was it? I looked toward the bedroom door. Toward the house beyond it. Toward the family I no longer recognized. Then I answered honestly. It was enlightening. Robert was silent. Perhaps he heard something in my voice. Because when he spoke again, his tone changed, more serious. Diane, are you sure you're ready? I thought about Melissa's laughter. The humiliation, the notebook filled with years of memories, the growing certainty inside me. And for the first time, my answer came without hesitation. Yes. A pause. Then Robert said something that would change everything. Good, because whenever you're ready, the house paperwork is waiting. The house paperwork. 3 simple words. But those words carried years of history, years of assumptions, years of secrets nobody else in the family understood. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the darkness. The tears had stopped. The sadness remained. But something new had joined it. Resolve. For years I had accepted whatever treatment came my way. For years I had chosen silence. For years I had convinced myself that enduring pain was the same thing as loving my family. That night, for the first time, I realized they were not the same thing at all. And downstairs, sleeping peacefully under my roof, my daughter had absolutely no idea that the foundation beneath her life was about to shift. The truth about our house was something almost nobody knew, not the neighbors, not most of our relatives, and certainly not the people who listened to Melissa talk as if she owned the place. The truth was buried under years of assumptions, years of silence. Years of me allowing a false story to grow because correcting it seemed easier than starting an argument. But every house has a history, and this one began long before Melissa ever moved back in. When Thomas and I bought the house, we were young and terrified. I was 29. He was 31. We had a 6-year-old daughter and exactly enough money to make a down payment if nothing went wrong. Of course, everything went wrong. The roof leaked. The furnace broke. The car died. There were months when we honestly didn't know how we would make the mortgage payment. But somehow we always did. Thomas worked overtime. I took bookkeeping jobs from home. We sacrificed vacations, skipped luxuries, made difficult choices. We built that house one payment at a time, one repair at a time, one sacrifice at a time. I still remember the day we made the final mortgage payment. Thomas came home carrying a bottle of cheap champagne. We sat on the living room floor because we hadn't finished buying furniture yet, and we celebrated like we'd won the lottery. "This house is ours," he kept saying. Ours. That word meant everything. Years later, when Melissa left for college, Thomas stood in her empty bedroom and smiled. "We did it, Diane." "What?" "We raised a good kid." Back then, I believed that too. Maybe that's why what happened later hurt so much. Because it wasn't just disappointment, it was grief. The grief of watching someone you love become someone you barely recognize. As the years passed, Thomas and I continued improving the house. We remodeled the kitchen, added a sunroom, replaced the roof, planted trees. Every corner carried our fingerprints. Every room held memories. When Thomas died, I couldn't imagine ever leaving. This wasn't just property. It was our life, our history, our story. And legally, after his death, everything passed to me. That wasn't unusual. We had prepared our estate years earlier. Robert Jenkins handled the paperwork. The process was straightforward. The house became mine, completely mine. There were no shared ownership agreements, no trusts involving Melissa, no inheritance transfers, nothing complicated, just me, the sole owner. At the time, ownership didn't seem important. Family seemed important. Which is why, when Melissa called asking for help, I welcomed her without hesitation. I didn't ask for rent. I didn't ask for utility contributions. I didn't create contracts. I didn't establish boundaries. I simply opened my door. Looking back, that may have been my biggest mistake, not helping her. I would help her again. The mistake was assuming gratitude would naturally follow generosity. Life doesn't work that way. Some people appreciate kindness. Others begin expecting it. The transition happens slowly. At first, Melissa introduced the house correctly. She would say things like, "My mom's house. We're staying with my mom." We moved in with her for a while. Then the language changed, subtly, almost invisibly. Our house, the house, home. Eventually, I noticed something stranger. When speaking to new people, Melissa sometimes implied the house belonged to her. The first time I heard it, I was shocked. We were speaking with one of her coworkers who had stopped by. The woman admired the property. "It's beautiful," she said. Melissa smiled proudly. "Thanks. We've put a lot into it. I remember staring at her, wondering if she'd correct herself. She didn't. The conversation moved on. Later that evening, I mentioned it. "Melissa, yeah. When your coworker was here, you made it sound like you owned the house." She looked genuinely annoyed. "Oh, Mom, does that really matter? The answer should have been obvious. Yes, it mattered. Not because I cared about recognition, because the truth mattered. But instead of arguing, I let it go. Again. That became my pattern, letting things go. Each time I did, the next offense became easier for her. A year later, I attended a family reunion. One of my cousins pulled me aside. "I didn't know Melissa bought your house." I laughed. "What?" That's what I heard. For several seconds, I couldn't even respond. The rumor had spread that far. Melissa had never directly told me she was claiming ownership. But clearly, somewhere along the way, people had been led to believe it. When I asked her about it later, she shrugged. "I never said I bought it. You didn't correct people either. What's the big deal?" The big deal. That phrase again. Every concern I raised became a big deal. Every boundary became an inconvenience. Every truth became optional. Over time, I started noticing something else. Melissa talked about the future as though ownership was inevitable. If we renovate this room someday, when Brian and I eventually redo the backyard, we'll probably replace these cabinets eventually. Always we. Always our plans. Never once asking whether I wanted those things. Never acknowledging that the final decision belonged to me. One afternoon, about 6 months before my birthday party, I overheard Melissa speaking with a neighbor in the driveway. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply happened to be near an open window. The neighbor asked a simple question. "Do you think you'll stay here long term?" Melissa laughed. "Oh, definitely." Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "This house will be mine eventually anyway. Mine eventually anyway." The confidence in her voice was startling, as though the outcome had already been decided, as though I were merely an obstacle waiting to disappear. That night, I sat awake thinking about those words, not because I planned to leave her nothing. I had never thought that way. What bothered me was the entitlement, the assumption, the certainty that my role in the story was over, as though my remaining years were just a waiting period, a countdown. I found myself wondering something uncomfortable. Had Melissa stopped seeing me as a person? Had I become merely the current occupant of assets she expected to inherit? The thought horrified me, because no mother wants to believe that about her child. I spent weeks trying to convince myself I was being unfair, too sensitive, too suspicious. Then more things happened. More comments, more assumptions, more evidence. And eventually the pattern became impossible to deny. One evening, I met Robert Jenkins for coffee. Officially, we were reviewing estate documents. Unofficially, I needed clarity. Robert listened carefully as I described some of what had been happening. Not everything, just enough. When I finished speaking, he folded his hands. "Diane, yes, you know your rights, correct?" I nodded. "I think so." "No." His voice was gentle but firm. "I mean your actual rights." I looked at him silently. "You own the property." He paused. "Nobody else." I already knew that. Yet hearing someone say it aloud felt strangely powerful. For years, I had behaved like a guest. For years, Melissa had behaved like an owner. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten reality. Robert continued, "You have spent so much time trying to avoid conflict that you've allowed people to rewrite the truth." That sentence stayed with me, because it was accurate, painfully accurate. I drove home that evening deep in thought. The sun was setting. The house appeared in the distance. The same house Thomas and I had fought so hard to keep. The same house everyone assumed would automatically become Melissa's. The same house whose ownership nobody questioned because I never corrected them. As I parked in the driveway, I noticed Melissa standing on the porch talking on her phone, laughing, confident, comfortable, like someone completely secure in her future. She didn't know it yet, but the foundation beneath that confidence wasn't nearly as solid as she believed. And for the first time, I began seriously considering what would happen if I stopped letting everyone else decide my story. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night. A completely ordinary Tuesday. Nothing special. Nothing dramatic. At least not at first. Dinner had ended around 7. I had cooked pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. One of Brian's favorite meals. He barely looked up from his phone while eating. Melissa spent most of dinner complaining about work. Sophie disappeared upstairs afterward to finish homework. By 9 o'clock, the house had settled into its usual routine. Brian was in the family room watching television. Melissa was upstairs. I was folding laundry in my bedroom. Just another evening. Just another day of trying to stay invisible. Around 10 o'clock, I realized I'd left my reading glasses downstairs. I got up and quietly walked into the hallway. The upstairs landing overlooked part of the family room below. As I approached the staircase, I heard voices. Melissa's voice. Brian's voice. Their conversation sounded serious. Normally, I would have continued downstairs without paying attention. But then I heard my name, and everything stopped. I froze where I stood. Not because I intended to eavesdrop, because something in Melissa's tone made my stomach tighten. "How much longer do you think this is going to take?" she asked. Brian sighed heavily. "I don't know." "Well, we can't keep waiting forever." Waiting for what I stood completely still. Below me, the television had been muted. Their voices carried clearly through the house. Brian lowered his voice. "Melissa, she's healthy?" The response came immediately. "Healthy? For now." A strange chill moved through my body. For now. I gripped the staircase railing, suddenly afraid of what I might hear next. Brian sounded uncomfortable. "I just think you're rushing things." Melissa laughed. Not her warm laugh. Not her happy laugh. The sharp laugh she used when she thought someone was being stupid. "Rushing what?" A pause. Then she continued. "The woman is almost 70. The woman. Not Mom. Not Diane. The woman." I felt something painful twist inside my chest. Brian remained silent. Melissa kept talking. "Look around." Another laugh. "She forgets things. Everybody forgets things." "Exactly. Which means it won't be difficult." My heart began pounding. Difficult. What wouldn't be difficult? For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Brian asked the question I was afraid to ask myself. "Have you seriously thought about assisted living?" The room went silent. My entire body tensed. Then Melissa answered. "Of course I have." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because of assisted living itself. Many wonderful people live in assisted living communities. The pain came from the casualness, the planning, the fact that they were discussing my future without me. As if I weren't a person, as if I were a problem to solve. Brian sounded uncertain. "I don't know." Melissa sighed dramatically. "You never know. She's still independent. She's becoming harder to deal with." I almost laughed. harder to deal with. I cooked their meals, cleaned their house, paid half their expenses. Yet somehow I was becoming difficult, Melissa continued. If she moves into a facility, everyone wins. Everyone wins. The words echoed through my mind. Everyone wins. Everyone except me. I felt suddenly dizzy. My knees weakened. I sat quietly on the top step, afraid I might fall. Below me, the conversation continued. Brian lowered his voice again. What about the house? The question changed everything. Until that moment, part of me had still been making excuses. Maybe Melissa was concerned. Maybe she genuinely believed she was helping. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Then she answered, and every excuse disappeared. What about it? If she leaves... A pause. Then Melissa said something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It'll finally be ours. Ours. Not hers someday. Not after my death. Not eventually. Ours. The certainty in her voice was terrifying. As though ownership was already guaranteed. As though I had already been erased. Brian hesitated. I don't think it's that simple. Of course it is. No, Melissa. Another pause. Then he asked quietly, doesn't she still own everything? My heart stopped. Finally, someone acknowledging reality. But Melissa sounded completely unconcerned. Technically? Technically. The word felt almost insulting. 30 years of mortgage payments. 30 years of sacrifice. And somehow ownership had become merely technical. Then she said something even worse. Once she's declared unable to manage things herself, it'll be easy. I felt all the air leave my lungs. Unable to manage things herself. Declared. The wording wasn't accidental. This wasn't a passing thought. This was planning. Actual planning. The notebook. The jokes. The comments about memory. The stories told to relatives. Suddenly everything connected. Like puzzle pieces snapping together. Melissa wasn't simply being cruel. She was creating a narrative. One where I was confused. Fragile. Dependent. Incompetent. A narrative that would justify taking control. I sat frozen, unable to move. Unable to breathe properly. Unable to believe what I was hearing. Brian sounded nervous now. I don't know if that's a good idea. Melissa laughed. You worry too much. What if she fights it? Another laugh. Confident. Dismissive. She won't. The certainty in those two words hurt more than anything else. She won't. Not because she trusted me. Because she thought I was weak. Because she believed I would never stand up for myself. Never push back. Never defend my own life. For years, I had trained everyone around me to expect my silence. And now they depended on it. The conversation continued for several more minutes. But honestly, I don't remember much of it. The important damage had already been done. I quietly returned to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bed. The room felt different. The house felt different. Everything felt different. For a long time, I simply stared at the wall. My mind replaying the conversation over and over. The woman is almost 70. Everyone wins. It'll finally be ours. She won't. Each sentence struck like a hammer. I expected anger. Instead, I felt grief. Deep, overwhelming grief. Because no matter how badly Melissa had behaved over the years, part of me still believed she loved me. Not perfectly, not kindly, but loved me. That conversation forced me to confront a possibility I had spent years avoiding. What if Melissa loved what I provided more than she loved me? The thought broke my heart. Around midnight, I walked downstairs. The house was dark, quiet. Everyone else was asleep. I entered the kitchen, made a cup of tea, and sat alone at the table. The same table where Thomas and I had shared thousands of conversations. I found myself wishing desperately that he were there, not because he could solve the problem, because he would understand it. He would understand the betrayal, the loneliness, the disbelief. Eventually, I got up and walked into the living room. His photograph sat on the mantel. I picked it up, held it carefully, and for the first time in years, I spoke aloud as if he were standing beside me. She thinks I'm weak. My voice cracked. A tear rolled down my cheek. Then another. And another. I don't know where we went wrong. The room remained silent. But somewhere inside that silence, another feeling began to emerge. Not sadness. Not grief. Something stronger. Resolve. Because for the first time, I understood exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't disrespect anymore. This wasn't selfishness. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was a plan. And if Melissa was planning my future without my permission, then I needed to start planning my own. The next morning, before anyone else woke up, I called one person. Carol Mitchell, my oldest friend, the woman who had known me for more than 40 years. When she answered, she immediately heard something in my voice. Diane, I swallowed hard. Carol, what happened? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I said 4 words that would change the course of my life. I think I'm ready. Ready for what? At that moment, I wasn't entirely sure. But for the first time in years, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer willing to sit quietly while other people decided what would happen to me. And neither Melissa nor Brian had any idea that their conversation the night before had just destroyed the last reason I had for staying. The morning after I overheard Melissa and Brian discussing my future, I woke up feeling strangely calm, not happy, not relieved, calm. The kind of calm that comes after a difficult decision has already been made. For years, I had lived in a constant state of emotional confusion. Should I speak up? Should I stay quiet? Was I overreacting? Was I imagining things? But after hearing that conversation, all uncertainty disappeared. The truth was finally clear. And clarity, even painful clarity, can be incredibly freeing. At 7 o'clock that morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and called Carol Mitchell, my oldest friend, the woman who knew me better than almost anyone alive. She answered on the second ring. Diane. Her voice sounded concerned immediately, as though she had sensed my call before it happened. Good morning. Diane. What happened? I stared out the kitchen window. The backyard looked peaceful. Birds hopped across the grass. The world seemed perfectly normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. I think I'm ready. There was a long silence. Then Carol asked softly, ready to leave? I closed my eyes. Yes. The word felt surprisingly powerful, not because I was leaving a house, because I was finally leaving a situation that had been destroying me piece by piece. Carol exhaled slowly. I've been waiting a long time to hear you say that. I laughed weakly. That obvious. Diane, I've known you for 43 years. She paused. You stopped sounding happy a long time ago. That hurt because it was true. For nearly an hour we talked. Really talked. Not the polite conversations people have when they're pretending everything is fine. The honest kind. The necessary kind. I told her everything. The comments. The humiliation. The birthday party. The conversation about assisted living. The plans for the house. The assumptions. The disrespect. When I finished, Carol was quiet. Then she said something I desperately needed to hear. You're not crazy. I laughed through tears. I know. No. Her voice grew firmer. I mean it. You've spent years questioning yourself because people around you keep minimizing what they're doing. I stared at the table because she was right. Every concern became an overreaction. Every hurt feeling became sensitivity. Every boundary became selfishness. Eventually you start doubting your own reality. Carol continued, Diane, you deserve peace. For some reason, those words made me cry. Not because they were profound, because nobody had said them to me in years. You deserve peace. The idea felt almost foreign. After our conversation ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I picked up my phone again. This time I called Robert Jenkins. He answered immediately. Diane, Robert, I'd like to move forward. His response came without hesitation. Good. As though he had been expecting the call. Perhaps he had. Over the next 2 hours, Robert explained everything. Every option, every protection, every legal detail. The house remained solely mine. No surprises, no complications, no hidden claims, no ownership rights for Melissa or Brian. Legally, the situation was straightforward. Emotionally, it was anything but. Before hanging up, Robert asked one final question. Have you decided where you're going? I looked down at the note Carol had texted me earlier. Her address in Wilmington, North Carolina, a place I had visited years ago. A beautiful coastal town filled with sunshine, beaches, and slower rhythms. A place that felt like possibility. Yes, I said. I think I have. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, I began making decisions based on what I wanted. Not what Melissa wanted. Not what Brian wanted. What I wanted. The realization felt strange, almost selfish. Then I realized how sad that was. A 68-year-old woman should not feel guilty for making decisions about her own life. Yet I did. Years of putting everyone else first had trained me that way. The next step was the bank. I scheduled an appointment the following day. The banker reviewed my accounts, investments, and property records. Everything was exactly where it should be. Healthy, stable, secure. As the meeting ended, the banker smiled. You've done a remarkable job planning for retirement. I almost laughed. If only Melissa knew. For years she had treated me like someone incapable of managing her own affairs. Meanwhile, I had quietly managed every aspect of my financial life without assistance. The contrast would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. 3 days later, I met with a property management company recommended by Robert. That meeting changed everything. The manager, a professional woman named Karen, reviewed market conditions and rental demand. Then she made a suggestion, one that immediately caught my attention. You know, she said, looking through the property details, this home would rent very quickly. I stared at her. Really? She smiled. Absolutely. The location was excellent. The schools were good. The neighborhood was desirable. Within minutes, my mind began turning. Until that moment, my plan had been simple. Leave. Move to North Carolina. Put distance between myself and the pain. But now another possibility emerged. A smarter possibility. One that protected my future. One that reclaimed my power. The following week, Karen arranged professional photographs of the property. She listed it quietly. Nothing public. Nothing dramatic. Nothing Melissa would notice. At least not yet. The response was immediate. Families began inquiring almost instantly. Several qualified applicants appeared within days. One family stood out. A married couple in their 40s. Excellent credit. Stable employment. Respectful. Reliable. After careful review, I approved them. A security deposit was submitted. Paperwork began. Everything completely legal. Everything completely documented. Everything completely real. For the first time in months, I felt excitement. Not revenge, excitement. The excitement that comes from realizing your future might actually be brighter than your past. Meanwhile, life inside the house continued normally. Or at least it appeared normal. Melissa still issued instructions. Brian still avoided conflict. I still cooked dinners. I still smiled politely. But something fundamental had changed. They believed I was trapped. I knew I wasn't. And that knowledge transformed everything. One evening, Sophie joined me on the back porch. The summer air felt warm and pleasant. We watched the sunset together. After several minutes, she glanced at me. "You seem different." I smiled. "Different how?" she thought carefully. "Stronger." The observation startled me. Children notice everything, even things adults miss. I looked out toward the yard. Maybe she was right. Not stronger physically, but stronger emotionally. Stronger because I had stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me. Eventually, Sophie returned inside. I remained on the porch, watching the sky darken, thinking about Thomas, thinking about Carol, thinking about the years I had spent sacrificing my own happiness for the comfort of others. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about choosing myself. A week later, the final piece fell into place. My moving arrangements, I met with a local moving company. A pleasant man named Greg walked through the house taking notes. Furniture, boxes, antiques, personal belongings, everything I intended to take. At the end of the consultation, he handed me a schedule. Moving date confirmed. Trucks reserved. Crew assigned. The plan was officially real. I sat in my car afterwards staring at the paperwork. For several moments, I simply held it. Then I smiled. Not a large smile, just a small one. The kind that appears when hope finally begins replacing fear. Because after years of feeling powerless, I finally had something again. A choice, a plan, a future. And the most remarkable part, Melissa still had absolutely no idea. Every day she walked through the house assuming she controlled the situation, assuming she knew exactly how the story would end, assuming I would remain silent forever. She couldn't have been more wrong. And very soon, I was going to tell her exactly what I planned to do. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness in my chest that no amount of coffee could cure. Charleston was unusually quiet that day. Rain clouds hung low over the neighborhood, and the old oak tree outside my kitchen window swayed gently in the wind. Robert used to say storms had a way of forcing people indoors, forcing them to sit with truths they had been avoiding. Perhaps he was right. Because there was one truth I had been avoiding for 11 years. After Robert died, I stopped opening certain doors in this house. Not physical doors. Emotional ones. There were rooms in grief that I simply refused to enter. His closet. His workshop. The attic where he stored old boxes. I told myself I was preserving memories. But maybe I had really been preserving pain. That morning, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I found myself climbing the narrow attic stairs. The wooden steps creaked beneath my feet. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Sunlight slipped through the small attic window, illuminating boxes that had not been touched in years. Christmas decorations. Old photo albums. Michael's school projects. And in the far corner, Robert's cedar chest. My breath caught. I hadn't opened it since the week after his funeral. The chest itself wasn't remarkable. It was handcrafted, polished by Robert's own hands decades ago. But what it contained had always felt sacred. Private. Untouchable. For years, I had convinced myself I wasn't ready. Maybe I wasn't. But life rarely waits until we feel ready. My hands trembled as I knelt beside it. The brass latch clicked open. Inside lay neatly organized folders, letters, and documents. That was Robert. Even in death, he remained organized. I smiled sadly. "Still taking care of us," I whispered. At the very top rested an envelope. My name was written across it in Robert's handwriting. Madeline. No one had called me by my full name quite like he had. Just seeing his handwriting made my eyes burn with tears. Then I noticed another line written beneath my name. A sentence. One I had never seen before. "Only open this if our family forgets who you are." I stopped breathing. My hands froze. For several seconds, I simply stared. The words felt impossible, as though Robert himself had reached across time. Forget who you are. Not forget what you own. Not forget what you leave behind. Forget who you are. Tears blurred my vision. "Oh, Robert," I whispered. "What did you know?" My husband had been many things. Patient. Kind. Quiet. But Robert had also been observant. He noticed details others missed. Years ago, he once predicted a business collapse months before it happened. He understood people better than most. Had he foreseen this? Had he worried about what might happen after he was gone? With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. I recognized his handwriting instantly. Steady. Precise. Familiar. I began to read. My dearest Maddie, if you are reading this letter, then something has happened that I prayed never would. Perhaps someone you love has mistaken your kindness for weakness. My heart stopped. Weakness. Was that what Michael and Jennifer saw when they looked at me now? An elderly woman living alone. Someone easy to move. Easy to convince. Easy to forget. I continued reading through tears. You have spent your entire life giving. To me, to Michael, to your students, to everyone around you. But promise me this, never allow anyone to convince you that age makes you less valuable. I pressed my hand over my mouth. Because for the first time since that dinner, I realized something painful. Part of me had already begun believing it. The world has a quiet way of making older women invisible. People speak over us, decide for us, patronize us, as though wisdom disappears with wrinkles. But Robert had never treated me that way. Not once. I continued reading. I know our son has a good heart, but good people can make terrible choices when fear enters their lives. I paused. Fear. Not evil. Fear. Robert always saw people with compassion, even before mistakes happened. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Years ago, I made arrangements to protect you if circumstances ever required it. My pulse quickened. Protect me. I turned the page. Attached to the letter was a list of account numbers, investment records, legal documents, and a name I recognized immediately. William Carter, Robert's former business partner. I had not spoken to William in nearly 8 years. The two men had worked together for decades. After Robert's death, life simply carried us in different directions. Beneath William's name was another note written by Robert. If you ever need help, William knows what to do. I stared at the documents in disbelief. What exactly had Robert done? The papers referenced trusts, investment accounts, financial holdings. Some terms I recognized. Others I did not. But one thing became clear very quickly. Robert had hidden more than memories. He had left safeguards, protections, a plan. Tucked inside the envelope was one final handwritten page. This one was shorter, more personal. My beautiful Maddie, if you are reading this, remember something important. You were strong before you met me. You will remain strong after I am gone. Do not surrender your dignity for the comfort of others. And if our family loses its way, guide them with wisdom, but never allow them to destroy you. By then, I was openly crying. Not the kind of crying that comes from pain. The kind that comes from being loved. Deeply. Completely. Even after death. I sat there in the attic for nearly an hour. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The world outside continued as normal. Cars passed. Dogs barked. People lived their ordinary lives. And inside that dusty attic, my life quietly changed. For days, I had felt powerless. Old. Vulnerable. Afraid. But Robert's words reminded me of something I had forgotten. I was still Madeleine Albright. The same woman who taught children for 35 years. The same woman who buried her husband and somehow kept living. The same woman who built a family from love and sacrifice. Age had changed my hair, not my worth. I carefully placed the documents back inside the envelope. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the cedar chest lining. A small sealed card. I had nearly missed it. Written on the front were 4 words. For the right moment. My hands trembled again. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was only a single sentence. Call William before signing anything. Nothing else. No explanation. No details. Just that. I stared at the card as thunder rolled outside. At that exact moment, a strange feeling settled over me. Not certainty. Not yet. But something close. For the first time since Michael placed those nursing home papers before me, I no longer felt helpless. Because perhaps Robert had anticipated something I never imagined. And perhaps my husband's final act of love had only just begun. I barely slept that night. Not because I was nervous. Strangely enough, I wasn't. For the first time in years, I felt certain. The decision had already been made. The paperwork was complete. The moving company was scheduled. The new tenants were preparing for their future. And I was preparing for mine. Around 5:30 the next morning, I got out of bed before anyone else. The house was silent. I walked downstairs and made coffee. Then I sat alone in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had spent thousands of mornings taking care of everyone else. But this morning felt different. This morning belonged to me. The sunrise slowly brightened the backyard. Birds chirped. The neighborhood began waking up. And somewhere across town, 2 moving trucks were getting ready to drive toward my house. At exactly 7 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was Greg, the moving coordinator. "Well, we're on our way, Miss Boyd." I smiled. "Thank you." After hanging up, I took one final look around the kitchen. The memories were everywhere. Thomas reading newspapers at the table, holiday dinners, birthday cakes, Christmas mornings. A lifetime contained inside walls and furniture. For a brief moment, sadness washed over me. Not regret, just sadness. Because no matter how painful the recent years had been, leaving still meant saying goodbye to a chapter of my life. Then I remembered Melissa laughing, and the sadness passed. By 8 o'clock, the rest of the family began waking up. Brian came downstairs first, half asleep, still wearing sweatpants. "Morning." "Good morning." He poured himself coffee, completely unaware that his life was about to change. Melissa appeared a few minutes later. She glanced at me, then smirked. "Still moving today?" The sarcasm was impossible to miss. I simply nodded. "Yes." She laughed. "Okay, Mom." Then she sat down and started scrolling through her phone. Neither of them believed me. Not even a little. For years, they had assumed I would never follow through on anything that might inconvenience them. That assumption was about to become very expensive. At 8:45, I heard the sound. A low rumble approaching from the end of the street. I looked out the front window and smiled. The trucks had arrived. Not one. 2 large moving trucks slowly turned into the driveway. Bright white, impossible to miss. The logos on the side reflected the morning sunlight. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. Then Melissa looked up. At first, she seemed confused. Then she stood, walked toward the window, and stared. The expression on her face was priceless. "What?" She blinked. "What is that?" I calmly sipped my coffee. "My moving company." Silence. Complete silence. Brian immediately stood up. His eyes widened. "You weren't joking." I looked at him. No. Outside, workers began stepping out of the trucks. Clipboards, uniforms, dollies, packing supplies. Professionals, prepared, efficient, very real. Melissa's face lost color. Wait. She looked back at me. What is going on? The confidence from the previous night had vanished. Completely. I stood from the table. It's exactly what I told you. No. Her voice grew sharper. No, no, no. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because this was the first moment she realized she might not actually control the situation. The doorbell rang. Right on schedule, I walked calmly toward the front door. Opened it. Greg stood there smiling. Good morning, Miss Boyd. Good morning. He glanced at his clipboard. We're ready whenever you are. Thank you. Behind me, Melissa was staring in disbelief. The workers entered the house. Professional, polite, efficient. They immediately began assessing furniture and inventory lists. Melissa finally found her voice. What are they doing? I answered simply. They're moving my belongings. Today? Yes. Her eyes widened further. But she looked around the room, as if reality itself had suddenly become unstable. But where are you taking everything? North Carolina. The answer seemed to frustrate her, because it was the same answer I had given before. The answer she had chosen not to believe. Meanwhile, the crew began working. One man carefully wrapped artwork. Another inventoried boxes. 2 others started preparing furniture. Then something happened. Something Melissa hadn't expected. One of the movers approached the dining room. The large oak dining table sat in the center. The same table Thomas and I had purchased 27 years earlier. The same table where countless family holidays had taken place. The mover checked his paperwork, then began preparing it for transport. Melissa immediately stepped forward. Wait. The worker paused. What? You can't take that. The mover looked confused. It's on the inventory list. Melissa turned toward me. The dining table isn't leaving. I met her eyes. Yes, it is. What are you talking about? It belongs to me. The room fell silent. Technically, Melissa already knew that. But hearing it spoken aloud seemed different. More real. More threatening. The workers continued. The dining table was carefully disassembled, wrapped, prepared for loading. Melissa stood frozen, watching. Then another worker entered the living room. The leather sofa, the matching armchairs, several antique pieces Thomas and I had collected over decades, all on the inventory list, all mine, one by one. They were tagged for removal. Melissa looked increasingly panicked. Mom, I remained calm. Yes, you can't take all this. I can. Why? The question surprised me. Why, as though ownership itself required explanation, as though I needed permission. I simply answered, because it's mine. Outside, neighbors had begun noticing. The trucks were impossible to ignore. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stood on her porch. Mr. Hernandez was watering his lawn while openly watching. A few other neighbors slowly appeared. Curiosity spreads quickly in suburban neighborhoods, especially when moving trucks arrive unexpectedly. By 10 o'clock, furniture was steadily being loaded. The house already looked different, larger, emptier, strangely unfamiliar. Melissa followed workers from room to room, arguing, questioning, objecting. But every conversation ended the same way. The items belonged to me. The paperwork was clear. The inventory was documented. The movers simply continued doing their jobs. Then came the moment everything truly changed. A worker approached the china cabinet, a beautiful antique that had belonged to Thomas's grandmother. Melissa stepped directly in front of it. No. The mover stopped. Melissa turned toward me, her voice trembling now. Mom, seriously. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time all morning, and I realized something. She wasn't upset because I was leaving. She was upset because she hadn't believed I could. There is a difference, a huge difference. If she loved me, she would have asked whether I was happy, whether I was scared, whether I needed anything. Instead, every question had been about furniture, possessions, ownership, control. That realization hurt. Even after everything, it still hurt. The movers continued working. The house continued emptying. And Melissa continued watching her assumptions collapse one piece at a time. But the furniture wasn't the worst part. Not even close. Because she still didn't know the biggest truth. She still didn't know what would happen after I left. She still believed this was simply a move, a temporary disruption, an inconvenience. She had no idea that the real shock was still coming. And within a few hours, standing in front of neighbors, movers, and her entire collapsing fantasy, she was finally going to learn exactly who owned the house she had spent years pretending was hers. By noon, the house barely looked like the same place. The dining room stood nearly empty. The living room echoed when people spoke. Entire sections of my life had already been loaded onto the trucks. And with every piece that disappeared through the front door, Melissa grew more frantic. At first, she'd been confused, then annoyed, then angry. Now she was terrified. Not because I was leaving, because she could finally see that she had completely misjudged me. For years, she had assumed I would never take action, never enforce a boundary, never challenge her version of reality. Now, standing in the middle of a half-empty house, she was watching that illusion collapse. The breaking point came shortly after lunch. A moving crew member carried the last box out of the sunroom. Melissa followed him to the driveway. Then she turned toward me. Her face was flushed with anger. Enough! The word exploded from her. Several neighbors immediately looked in our direction. I stepped onto the front porch. Calmly, quietly, Melissa. No, she pointed toward the trucks. What are you doing? I answered honestly. I'm moving. Stop saying that, her voice echoed across the street. A curtain moved in Mrs. Patterson's window. More neighbors were watching now. Brian stood near the garage looking deeply uncomfortable. For once, he wasn't hiding behind silence. He looked genuinely nervous. Melissa walked closer. You can't just strip the house and leave. I can. No, you can't. The certainty in her voice was gone. Now it sounded desperate. And desperation often reveals truths people try to hide. Where am I supposed to live? She demanded. There it was. Not why are you leaving, not are you okay. Not can we fix this. Where am I supposed to live? I felt a painful ache in my chest. Because even now, she still didn't understand. Or maybe she did. Maybe she simply cared more about consequences than causes. I reached into my purse. Melissa noticed immediately. What is that? I removed a large manila folder. The same folder Robert had prepared. The same folder that contained every document she never thought she'd see. For the first time all day, complete silence settled over the driveway. Even the neighbors seemed to stop moving. I opened the folder carefully, then removed several papers. Melissa frowned. "What are those?" I met her eyes. "Documentation." The color drained from her face. Because somewhere deep down, she already knew. Brian took a step forward, his expression suddenly serious. "What kind of documentation?" Without answering immediately, I handed the first document to Melissa. She looked at it, confused, then read the heading, and froze. Property deed. I watched her eyes move across the page, watched her expression slowly change. Confusion, disbelief, shock, then panic. "No." Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "No." I remained calm. The deed clearly listed ownership. Diane Boyd, sole owner. No ambiguity, no shared rights, no joint ownership. No Melissa, no Brian. Just me. Melissa looked up. "This can't be right." "It is." "No." Her breathing quickened. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't." Brian took the paperwork from her hands. His face turned pale almost immediately. He kept reading, then reading again. As though the words might somehow change, they didn't. The truth remained exactly where it had always been. Melissa suddenly laughed, a nervous laugh. The kind people use when reality becomes too uncomfortable. "Fine." She waved dismissively. "You own the house." The statement sounded forced, as if she were trying to minimize the significance. Then she crossed her arms. "So what?" That question surprised even me. So what? I almost admired her determination to avoid reality. Almost. I removed another document from the folder and handed it to Brian. He looked down. His eyes widened instantly, far wider than before. Unlike Melissa, he understood paperwork, and he immediately recognized what he was reading. His face lost all color. "Oh my God." Melissa turned toward him. "What?" He didn't answer. He simply stared at the page. "What?" she demanded again. Finally, Brian looked up. His voice sounded hollow. "Diane rented the property." The world seemed to stop. Even the wind felt quieter. Melissa blinked. "What?" "The house." Brian swallowed hard. "The house has been rented." Several seconds passed. Melissa simply stared at him, unable to process the words. Then she laughed. Again. Another nervous laugh. "That's ridiculous." Brian handed her the lease agreement. She grabbed it, read it, and froze. I watched the exact moment reality finally reached her. The moment denial became impossible. A signed lease, a security deposit, move-in date, legal documentation. Everything complete, everything valid, everything enforceable. Her hands began trembling. "You rented the house." "Yes." "You rented my house." The sentence escaped before she could stop herself. "My house." Not our house. Not your house. Not Mom's house. My house. The truth had finally slipped out. I looked at her quietly, then answered. "No." The single word landed like a hammer. "No." She stared. I continued. "I rented my house." Silence. Absolute silence. For years I had avoided confrontation. For years I had chosen peace over truth. That moment felt strangely liberating, not because I wanted to humiliate her, because I was finally refusing to disappear. Melissa's voice shook. "You can't do this." "I already did." "What about us?" The question came too late. Years too late. I took a deep breath, then handed her the final document. The notice. She looked down, read the first paragraph, then the second. And suddenly her entire body went rigid. 30 days. The lease arrangement allowed 30 days before occupancy requirements became effective. 30 days, not 30 years, not forever. 30 days. You want us out? The question broke something inside me. Because it wasn't accurate. I didn't want her out. I wanted respect. I wanted honesty. I wanted a daughter. What I received instead was entitlement, manipulation, and plans for my future that never included my consent. I looked directly at her. I want my life back. For the first time all day, tears appeared in her eyes. Not many. Just enough to reveal genuine fear. Meanwhile, the neighbors were openly watching. Nobody pretended otherwise anymore. The entire street had witnessed the confrontation, the moving trucks, the documents, the truth, everything. Melissa looked around as if searching for support, but none came. Not from Brian, not from the neighbors, not from reality. Brian finally spoke. His voice sounded strained. "When did you do all this?" "Months ago." His eyes widened. Months. The realization clearly unsettled him. Because it meant I wasn't acting emotionally. I wasn't being impulsive. I wasn't confused. I had planned everything carefully, methodically, intelligently. Exactly the opposite of the image Melissa had spent years creating. The image of an aging woman incapable of managing her affairs. That image died in the driveway that afternoon, and everyone knew it, especially Melissa. She stared at me for a long time, then asked the question that mattered most. Why? I could have listed 100 reasons. The insults, the disrespect, the manipulation, the plans for assisted living, the assumptions, the humiliation. But I chose the simplest answer, because it was also the truest. Because I finally realized that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to mistreat you. The words hung between us, heavy, painful, unavoidable. For the first time in years, Melissa had no response, no joke, no eye roll, no dismissive comment, nothing. Just silence, and standing there beside 2 moving trucks, in front of an entire neighborhood, my daughter finally understood something she had never believed possible. I wasn't leaving because I had nowhere else to go. I was leaving because I had finally remembered that I had a choice. After the confrontation in the driveway, the atmosphere inside the house became almost unbearable. Nobody knew what to say. The moving trucks were gone. Most of my belongings were already on their way to North Carolina. The rooms felt hollow. The walls seemed to echo. And for the first time since Melissa moved in, the house felt like a place where the truth had finally entered. Melissa barely spoke for the rest of the afternoon. She stayed in her room. Brian disappeared into the garage. Even the neighbors seemed unusually quiet whenever they passed by the property. Everyone had witnessed something important, not just a family argument. A shift in power, a collapse of assumptions, a woman refusing to be erased. That evening, after dinner, I sat alone on the back porch. The summer air was warm. Crickets chirped in the distance. The sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. In less than 48 hours, I would be leaving Ohio. The thought felt surreal, exciting, sad, liberating. All at once, I was staring into the yard when I heard the screen door open. Soft footsteps followed. I turned. Sophie stood there. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. Then she sat beside me. Her eyes were red, as though she had been crying. I immediately felt concerned. "Sophie," she looked down, twisting her fingers together nervously. "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. The seriousness in her voice was impossible to miss. "What is it, sweetheart?" For several seconds she remained silent. Then tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken, almost whispered. I immediately wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Why are you apologizing?" She started crying. Not dramatically, not loudly. The quiet crying of someone carrying guilt for too long. And suddenly I understood. She wasn't crying about me leaving. She was crying about something else, something heavier, something she had been holding inside. I should have said something sooner. I waited patiently, letting her gather herself. Eventually she took a shaky breath. Then she looked directly at me. "Mom has been lying." The words hit harder than I expected, not because I was shocked, because I wasn't, but because hearing it from Sophie made it real in a different way. "What kind of lies?" Sophie wiped her eyes. Then she answered. "About you." A knot formed in my chest. I stayed silent, encouraging her to continue. She looked away toward the backyard, as though the grass was easier to face than the truth. "For over a year, she's been telling people that you're getting confused." I felt my stomach drop. Not because I didn't suspect it, because now I knew. Without question, without doubt, without excuses. Sophie continued. "At first it was little things." I listened carefully. "She'd tell relatives you forgot appointments." I nodded. There had been a few forgotten appointments. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Then Sophie added, "Except sometimes you didn't forget." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" Her voice shook. "Sometimes she'd tell people you forgot things that never happened." The world seemed to stop. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. "Never happened." She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Grandma, she made things up." I closed my eyes. A wave of sadness washed through me. Not anger, not yet. Just sadness. Deep sadness. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't exaggeration. This was deliberate, carefully deliberate. Sophie continued speaking, almost as though once she started, she couldn't stop. "She told Aunt Rebecca that you got lost driving." I frowned. "I never got lost." "I know." Another tear slid down her face. "She told Uncle Mark you forgot your bank password." "I didn't." "I know." Each sentence felt heavier than the one before. Piece by piece, a picture was emerging. The same picture I had begun suspecting after overhearing the conversation with Brian. Melissa wasn't simply portraying me as older. She was portraying me as incapable, creating a narrative, building a case, preparing people to believe something that wasn't true. My heart broke, not for myself, for the daughter I once knew, the little girl who used to bring me wildflowers, the teenager who cried when our family dog died, the young woman who once hugged me and said she never wanted to lose me. Where had she gone? What had happened to her? Sophie hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There's more." The words instantly alarmed me. More I wasn't sure I wanted to hear more. But I nodded. "Tell me." She swallowed hard, then said the sentence that changed everything. I heard Mom talking to someone about power of attorney. I froze. The air seemed to leave my lungs. Power of attorney. The phrase landed like a hammer. Not because power of attorney is inherently bad. It can be an important legal tool, but in this context, after everything else, it felt sinister. Very sinister. When? I asked quietly. A few months ago. Who was she talking to? I don't know. Sophie shook her head. I only heard part of the conversation. My pulse quickened. What did she say? Sophie's eyes filled again. She said she just needed enough people to believe you couldn't manage things yourself. The words hit harder than anything I'd heard yet. Harder than the birthday humiliation. Harder than the jokes. Harder than the conversation about assisted living. Because this wasn't disrespect. This wasn't selfishness. This was strategy. A plan. An actual plan. Suddenly everything connected. Every joke about memory. Every exaggerated story. Every comment about aging. Every false concern. Every rumor, every lie, the pattern became undeniable. She wasn't simply diminishing me. She was preparing to replace me, control me, manage me, take over my life while convincing everyone it was for my own good. I stared out across the yard, unable to speak, unable to process the full weight of it. Beside me, Sophie quietly cried. Then she whispered, I didn't know what to do. My heart broke. I immediately pulled her into a hug, a tight one. The kind people need when they've been carrying something too heavy. You don't need to apologize. But I should have told you. You were protecting yourself. I was scared. I know. And I did know. Because Sophie had been trapped too, living between loyalty and truth, between mother and grandmother. No child should ever be placed in that position. We sat together for a long time, the sky growing darker above us. Eventually Sophie spoke again. What happens now? The question lingered between us. What happens now? I thought about North Carolina. About Carol, about freedom, about rebuilding my life. Then I thought about Melissa. For the first time all day, anger finally appeared. Not explosive anger, not revenge, something colder, more painful, disappointment. Because even after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe she would stop before crossing certain lines. Now I wasn't so sure. I squeezed Sophie's hand. What happens now is that I leave. She nodded slowly, then looked at me. Are you angry? I considered the question carefully. The truthful answer surprised even me. No. Her eyebrows lifted. No. I shook my head. I'm hurt. That was the real emotion. Not anger. Heartbreak. Because anger eventually fades. Heartbreak lingers. Heartbreak mourns what could have been. And as darkness settled over the backyard, I realized something important. Melissa wasn't losing control because I was leaving. She was losing control because the truth was finally catching up to her. And very soon, more people were going to learn exactly what she had been doing behind closed doors. The next morning, I left Ohio. Not forever. At least, not in the dramatic way people imagine. But I left the version of my life that had been suffocating me. And that mattered more. The sun hadn't fully risen when Carol arrived to pick me up. The moving trucks were already gone. Most of my belongings were somewhere between Ohio and North Carolina. The house stood unusually quiet, almost empty, almost peaceful. I carried a single overnight bag to Carol's car. She stepped out and immediately wrapped me in a hug. A real hug. The kind that says, "You don't have to explain anything." The kind I hadn't received in a very long time. "You ready?" she asked. I looked back at the house. At the porch where Thomas and I had shared coffee. At the windows where Christmas lights once glowed. At the front door through which Melissa had carried boxes 8 years earlier. So much history. So many memories. Some beautiful. Some painful. I smiled sadly. Yes. And for the first time in years, I meant it. As we pulled away, I noticed movement at an upstairs window. Melissa, watching. She didn't wave, neither did I. Then the house disappeared behind us. And a chapter of my life officially ended. The drive to North Carolina took most of the day. Carol and I talked for hours, sometimes about serious things, sometimes about nothing at all. The simple act of sitting beside someone who genuinely cared about me felt healing. No criticism, no judgment, no manipulation, no walking on eggshells. Just friendship. At one point, somewhere in Virginia, Carol glanced at me. "You seem lighter." I laughed softly. "I feel lighter." And it was true. The strange thing about emotional burdens is that you don't fully realize how heavy they are until you finally put them down. By the time we reached Wilmington, the sun was setting. The town looked exactly as I remembered. Beautiful coastal streets, historic buildings, ocean air, palm trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. Possibility. That was the word that came to mind. Possibility. Carol's guest room was lovely, bright, comfortable, peaceful. That first night, I slept better than I had in years. No tension, no anxiety, no wondering what criticism awaited me the next morning. Just sleep. Deep, uninterrupted sleep. When I woke up the next day, something surprising happened. My phone was full of messages. Dozens of them. Some from relatives, some from neighbors, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Apparently news traveled fast. Very fast. Especially after a public confrontation involving moving trucks, legal documents, and a stunned daughter. At first, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore everything. Start fresh. Move forward. But eventually I began reading. The first message came from my cousin Rebecca. "Diane, is everything okay? Melissa told us for years that she was taking care of you. We had no idea what was really happening." I stared at the screen. Then another message. This one from a neighbor. "I always wondered why you looked so unhappy. I wish I had checked on you sooner." Then another. And another. The pattern quickly became obvious. People were beginning to compare notes, beginning to question things, beginning to realize they had been told a very different story than the truth. By lunchtime, I received a call from Aunt Margaret, 82 years old, blunt as a hammer, always had been. She didn't waste time with small talk. "Diane." "Yes." "I just got off the phone with Melissa." That immediately caught my attention. "And," Aunt Margaret snorted, "and she tried to tell me you abandoned her." I nearly laughed. Abandoned her. The irony was astonishing. "What did you say?" "I asked her who owned the house." I smiled. "What happened?" "She changed the subject." That made me laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes from genuine amusement. Apparently, the narrative Melissa had carefully built over the years was beginning to collapse. And once people start questioning a story, it becomes very difficult to control. Over the next week, more truths surfaced. Not because I exposed them, because people started asking questions. Questions Melissa couldn't answer. Questions that contradicted the image she had spent years creating. Why did Diane pay most household expenses if she was dependent? Why did Diane manage her own finances? Why was Diane healthy enough to coordinate a complex interstate move? Why did Diane own the property outright? Why did Diane never actually need assistance? The answers were obvious. The story never made sense. People had simply never examined it closely. Meanwhile, Melissa was struggling. Not financially yet, emotionally, socially. The version of events she had relied upon no longer worked. And for perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was facing consequences. Then something happened that surprised me. Brian called. It was a Tuesday evening. Carol and I were sitting on our back deck watching the sunset. My phone rang. Brian's name appeared. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to answer. Eventually, I did. Hello? For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Brian cleared his throat. Diane. His voice sounded exhausted. More exhausted than I had ever heard him. Brian? Another pause. Then he said something I never expected. You were right. I blinked. What? You were right. The words sounded painful for him to say. As though each one carried weight, I remained silent, letting him continue. About everything. The sunset blurred slightly as emotion rose unexpectedly inside me. Not satisfaction. Sadness. Because admissions like that usually arrive far too late. Brian sighed heavily. I should have spoken up years ago. I looked out toward the ocean in the distance. You should have. Melissa wouldn't listen. Neither did you. The silence that followed felt honest. Painfully honest. Finally, he answered. No. He sounded defeated. I didn't. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Brian surprised me again. She's not handling this well. The statement didn't shock me. I had expected as much. What happened? Brian laughed bitterly. A lot. Then he explained. Relatives were asking questions. Neighbors were talking. People who once accepted Melissa's version of reality were beginning to doubt it. And doubt is dangerous when your reputation depends on a carefully maintained illusion. The conversation lasted nearly half an hour. By the time it ended, I felt emotionally drained. But one thing had become clear. The consequences had only begun, and Melissa was finally being forced to face something she had avoided for years. The truth, not my version, not her version. The truth, the kind that survives after excuses disappear. The kind that remains after manipulation fails. The kind that eventually catches everyone. That night, after the call ended, I sat alone on Carol's deck, listening to waves in the distance, watching stars appear overhead. For the first time in a very long time, I felt peace. Real peace. Not the fake peace that comes from staying silent. The genuine kind. The kind built on self-respect. And although I didn't know it yet, the most important conversation of this entire story was still ahead of me, because sooner or later, Melissa herself was going to call. And when she did, everything would finally come into the open. The morning after Emma's visit, I woke before dawn. Not because I had slept well. Quite the opposite. Some nights, age steals sleep. Other nights, worry does. That night, worry had won. The sky outside was still dark as I sat alone at my kitchen table with Robert's letter spread before me. For the 100th time, I read the final instruction. Call William before signing anything. For 11 years, that sentence had waited quietly in a cedar chest, waiting for this exact moment. I traced Robert's handwriting with my fingertips. Even now, it amazed me how love could outlive death. How a man could still protect his wife long after he was gone. At precisely 8:30 that morning, I picked up the phone. My heart pounded harder than it had in years. William Carter. I hadn't spoken to him since shortly after Robert's funeral. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years. Then life, as it often does, quietly carried us in different directions. I dialed the number listed in Robert's envelope. To my surprise, it still worked. The phone rang twice. Then a familiar voice answered. William Carter speaking. For a moment, I couldn't speak. His voice sounded older, slower, but unmistakably the same. William. A brief silence followed. Then warmth entered his voice immediately. Madeline. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. It had been so long since someone who truly knew Robert had spoken his name. Hello, William? My goodness, he said softly, after all these years. We talked awkwardly for a few minutes. About Charleston. About aging. About grandchildren. The safe subjects older people often discuss when they are avoiding painful ones. Finally, I took a deep breath. William, I found a letter from Robert. The line went silent. Not surprised. Not confused. Silent. My pulse quickened. You know about the letter. It wasn't a question. William exhaled slowly. Yes. A chill ran through me. Robert truly had planned this. Did he leave instructions for you too? I asked quietly. Another pause. Then William answered. Yes, Maddie, he did. Maddie. Only Robert and a few old friends still called me that. The sound nearly broke my heart. What exactly did Robert ask you to do? William's voice became serious. He told me to wait. Wait for what? For your call. I closed my eyes. 11 years. Robert had prepared something 11 years ago. And William had waited all this time. Madeline, William said gently, I think it's time we meet. 2 hours later, I drove to a small cafe overlooking Charleston Harbor. William was already there when I arrived. Time had changed him. His hair was completely white now. His shoulders slightly bent. But his eyes were still sharp. The same eyes that once helped Robert build a successful engineering consulting firm decades ago. When he saw me, he stood immediately. And without saying a word, he hugged me. For a moment, I felt as though a small piece of Robert had returned. We sat near the window overlooking the water. Neither of us rushed. People our age understand that important conversations deserve patience. After coffee arrived, William reached into his leather briefcase. My breath caught. Inside was a thick manila folder. Very thick. He carefully placed it on the table between us. This belongs to you. I stared at it. What is it? William looked directly into my eyes. Robert's final plan. My hands began trembling. Slowly, I opened the folder. Inside were account statements, investment reports, legal papers, trust documents, and page after page of financial records. At first, none of it made sense. Then I saw a number. I blinked. Surely I had read it incorrectly. I looked again. No. The number remained the same. My heart nearly stopped. William? My voice barely worked. This can't be right. He nodded quietly. It is. I stared at the figure. Over $3 million. $3 million? My hands shook so violently I had to set the papers down. Robert and I had lived comfortably, but never lavishly. We drove modest cars, took simple vacations, clipped coupons, waited for sales. $3 million was unimaginable. I looked at William in disbelief. Robert never told me. William smiled sadly. That was intentional. I couldn't speak. He continued gently. Your husband invested carefully for decades, quietly, patiently. He never touched those accounts. I thought back to Robert's habits, his spreadsheets, his notebooks, his endless patience. I used to tease him for reading financial reports during vacations. Now tears burned my eyes. He had never been planning for himself. He had been planning for me. For all these years I whispered. William nodded. Even before he got sick. My chest tightened. Robert had known. Not only about his illness, about life. Its uncertainties. Its dangers. Its disappointments. He made me promise something, William said softly. I swallowed. What? William's voice lowered. He said, if Madeline ever calls you, it means she needs protection, not money. Protection. That word again. Not money. Protection. Suddenly, I understood Robert better than ever before. This was never about wealth. It was about dignity, security, freedom. The freedom to never depend on someone who might misuse that dependence. I wiped my eyes. Why keep it secret from Michael? William's expression grew thoughtful. Robert loved your son. I know. But he worried. My stomach tightened. About what? William hesitated. Robert once told me that Michael had a generous heart but struggled with financial discipline. I closed my eyes. Even then. Robert had seen it even then. He believed hardship teaches lessons money cannot. The truth of those words settled heavily inside me. Because over the years, Robert and I had repeatedly rescued Michael. Every setback, every emergency, every mistake. Perhaps we had protected him too well. Perhaps love sometimes becomes shelter from consequences. William reached for another envelope inside the folder. This one carried my name. Madeline Albright. Robert's handwriting again. My chest ached. Another letter, I whispered. William nodded. He asked me to give you this only if the first letter was ever opened. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The letter was shorter, more personal. My dearest Maddie, if you are reading this, then life has become harder than I hoped it would. Remember something important: money reveals character, it does not create it. Use what I leave behind wisely. Help when help creates growth. Do not help when help creates dependency. I stopped reading. Dependency. The word struck me deeply. How many times had I confused rescuing with loving? How many times had I saved Michael from consequences that might have taught him responsibility? Tears slipped quietly down my cheeks. William gave me time. Old friends know when silence is kindness. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me for weeks. William? Yes. If Michael knew about this money, I couldn't finish. William answered anyway. Everything would become worse. The painful truth hung between us. He was right. $3 million would not solve desperation. It might only feed it. We spent another hour reviewing documents, trust structures, investment protections. Robert had built safeguards upon safeguards. The man had truly planned for everything. Everything except dying too soon. When I finally left the cafe, the sun hung low over the harbor. The world looked unchanged. Cars moved. People laughed. Seagulls circled overhead. And yet my entire future had shifted. For weeks, I had feared becoming powerless. Now I realized something extraordinary. I had never been powerless. I simply hadn't known what Robert had left behind. Driving home, I felt emotions I could barely name. Relief, grief, love, sorrow, strength, and beneath them all, clarity. Michael believed I was vulnerable. Jennifer believed I was alone. Neither of them knew the truth. Neither knew about Robert's investments. Neither knew about William. Neither knew about the trust. And most importantly, neither of them knew that the woman they were trying to move into a nursing home had just discovered she was worth millions. But strangely enough, the money was no longer the greatest surprise. The greatest surprise was realizing that even after death, Robert had never stopped protecting me. The letter changed everything. Not immediately, not dramatically. There wasn't a sudden transformation, no miraculous overnight reconciliation. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, the change came slowly, painfully, one uncomfortable truth at a time. 2 weeks after Sophie told me Melissa had read the letter, another call came. This time, I almost didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I was tired, emotionally tired. Healing had required energy. Building a new life had required energy. And part of me feared being pulled back into old patterns. But eventually I picked up. Hello? Mom. Melissa. Her voice sounded different again. Not defensive. Not angry. Just tired. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. I found the notebook. I froze. The notebook. The one hidden in my closet. The one where I had recorded years of memories. Years of comments. Years of incidents. Not for revenge. For clarity. For my own sanity. Because when someone constantly tells you that you're imagining things, eventually you need proof that you're not. I see. Another pause. Then Melissa whispered. I read it. My eyes closed. Part of me had always expected this moment. Eventually. What did you think? The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had disconnected. Then she answered. I didn't realize. The words sounded broken, raw, human. I leaned back in my chair, looking out toward the ocean. You didn't realize what? A shaky breath. How often I hurt you. The honesty startled me, not because it was impossible, because it was rare. For years, every conversation had revolved around excuses. Now there were none. Melissa continued. I remembered some of those moments differently. I wasn't surprised. People often do, especially when remembering themselves requires accountability. The birthday party. Her voice cracked. I thought I was being funny. I remained silent. I didn't understand what it sounded like. Another pause. Then, I made you look foolish. The admission hurt, because it was true. And hearing someone finally acknowledge a painful truth can be strangely emotional. Not satisfying. Emotional. For the next hour, we talked. Really talked. For perhaps the first time in a decade. Not as enemies. Not even as mother and daughter. As two flawed people confronting reality. Melissa admitted things she had never admitted before. Her resentment. Her entitlement. Her assumptions. The way she convinced herself she deserved things simply because she was family. The way she gradually stopped seeing me as an independent person. The way she assumed I would always forgive everything. Always stay. Always remain available. Then she said something that stunned me. I think I started treating you like furniture. I blinked. What? She laughed bitterly. You know, her voice trembled. Something that was always there. The sentence broke my heart, because it perfectly described the problem. Not hatred, not cruelty. Worse, taking someone for granted. The slow erosion of appreciation. The assumption that love removes the need for respect. It doesn't. It never does. Toward the end of the conversation, Melissa asked a question. One she had clearly been afraid to ask. Can you ever forgive me? I looked toward the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a blue afternoon sky. Forgiveness. Such a complicated word. People often confuse forgiveness with forgetting, or reconciliation, or permission. They aren't the same. Finally, I answered honestly. I already forgive you. Silence. Then a quiet sob. Because forgiveness had never been the difficult part. The difficult part was trust. And trust rebuilds slowly, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. Several weeks passed, then months. Summer gradually became autumn. My new life continued growing. I rented a small cottage near the water. Not extravagant, not large, but mine, completely mine. For the first time in decades, every object inside my home belonged exactly where I wanted it. Every room reflected my choices, my preferences, my peace. I joined a local book club, made new friends, started volunteering twice a week at a community center, even took painting lessons. Painting, something I'd wanted to try since my 40s. Life wasn't ending. It was beginning again. And perhaps that was the biggest surprise of all. Meanwhile, Melissa began changing too. At least she seemed to. Not through promises, through actions. She found a smaller rental home with Brian. started paying her own bills, stopped blaming everyone else for her problems. And perhaps most importantly, she started listening. Really listening. One October afternoon, Sophie visited North Carolina by herself. The moment she arrived, she wrapped her arms around me. "I missed you." I laughed. "I missed you too." We spent 3 wonderful days together, walking on the beach, eating seafood, watching movies, talking, just talking. No tension, no drama, no manipulation, the way family relationships are supposed to feel. On the second evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed gold and orange. Beautiful beyond words. Then Sophie smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "You're different." I laughed. "People keep saying that, because it's true." She studied me for a moment. "You seem happy all the time now." The observation made me smile, because happiness wasn't exactly the right word. Not all the time. Life doesn't work that way. But peace, yes. I had peace. And peace is often more valuable than happiness. That night, after Sophie went to bed, I sat alone on the porch, thinking, reflecting, remembering. My phone buzzed. A text message from Melissa. "Can I visit sometime?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. A year earlier, that message would have filled me with anxiety. Now it simply made me thoughtful. Finally, I typed a reply. "Yes." A few moments later, another message arrived. "Thank you." Then one more. "For everything." I looked up at the stars, bright above the ocean. And for the first time, I felt genuine hope. Not certainty, not complete healing, hope. Because people can change. Not everyone, not always, but sometimes, if they are willing to confront the truth. And the truth had finally reached Melissa. The same truth she spent years avoiding. The same truth that arrived with moving trucks, legal documents, and consequences. The same truth that ultimately saved both of us, because leaving hadn't destroyed my family. Oddly enough, it might have been the only thing that gave us a chance to rebuild it. A year after the moving trucks pulled into my driveway, I stood barefoot on a North Carolina beach and watched the sunrise. The sky glowed with soft shades of pink and gold. Waves rolled gently onto the shore. The air smelled of salt and possibility. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at home. Not because of the location, because of who I had become. A year earlier, I thought leaving was about escaping disrespect, escaping manipulation, escaping a life that had become painful. Now I understood something different. Leaving hadn't been about running away. It had been about returning to myself. The woman I had spent years neglecting. The woman hidden beneath obligations, guilt, sacrifice, and silence. The woman who deserved to exist even when nobody else approved. I smiled as I watched the waves. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from Sophie. "Landing in Wilmington in an hour. Can't wait to see you." My smile widened immediately. Some relationships survive storms. Some even grow stronger because of them. Sophie had visited several times during the past year. Each visit became a reminder that healthy love doesn't require control. It doesn't require guilt. It doesn't require sacrifice without limits. It simply requires care. Mutual care. Something I had forgotten for far too long. After breakfast, I drove to the airport. When Sophie emerged from the terminal, she ran toward me. Still the same sweet girl. Though not really a girl anymore, she was 17 now, confident, thoughtful, strong. She hugged me tightly. I missed you. I missed you too. During the drive home, she talked nonstop. School, friends, college plans, life. The kind of conversations that make time disappear. At one point she smiled and said, "You know Mom's nervous." I laughed. "Nervous about what? Seeing you next month?" I glanced at her. Next month. The family visit. The one Melissa had been carefully planning for weeks. The visit that neither of us had mentioned directly. Until now. I remained quiet. Eventually, Sophie asked, "Are you scared?" The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully. Then answered honestly, "No." And I wasn't. Because fear usually comes from uncertainty. And I was no longer uncertain about who I was. That changed everything. The following month, Melissa arrived, alone. No Brian, no distractions, just her. I noticed how different she looked. Not older, humble. Life had a way of teaching lessons that pride refuses to learn voluntarily. For a moment, we simply stood facing each other. Then she walked forward and hugged me. Neither of us spoke. Words weren't necessary. Some moments exist beyond language. Eventually, we sat on the porch overlooking the water, a place that had become my favorite spot. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, peaceful, steady, patient, much like healing itself. For a while, we talked about simple things: travel, Sophie, the weather, life. Then finally, Melissa took a deep breath and said, "I owe you an apology." I smiled gently. "You already apologized." She shook her head. "No." Tears appeared in her eyes. "I apologized because I felt guilty." The honesty caught my attention. She continued, "Now I understand. That was different. Very different. Guilt focuses on consequences. Understanding focuses on impact." Melissa looked toward the ocean. "I spent years believing I deserved things simply because I was your daughter. I listened quietly. I thought your love was permanent no matter how I behaved." A tear rolled down her cheek. And maybe it was. She laughed softly. "That's the problem." I understood exactly what she meant. A mother's love often survives things it shouldn't have to survive. But surviving isn't the same as thriving. Melissa wiped her eyes. "I stopped treating you like a person." The words echoed the realization she'd shared months earlier. But now they sounded deeper, more complete, more real. "I treated you like a resource." The sentence hurt, not because it was new, because it was true. And sometimes the truth hurts no matter how many times you hear it. We talked for hours. Longer than we had talked in years. No defensiveness, no blame, no rewriting history, just honesty. When the sun began setting, Melissa reached into her purse, then handed me an envelope. I frowned. "What's this?" "A letter." I laughed softly. "Another one." She smiled through tears. "Fair." I accepted it, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. "What do you want from me?" "Melissa." The answer came instantly. "Nothing. Not money. Not property. Not favors. Nothing. I just want the chance to do better." The simplicity of the answer nearly made me cry, because a year earlier, every conversation revolved around what she wanted to take. Now the conversation centered on what she wanted to become. That was growth. Real growth. Not perfection. Growth. and growth deserves recognition. That evening, after she left for her hotel, I opened the letter. I sat on the porch alone, listening to waves, watching stars appear overhead, and I read. The letter wasn't perfect, neither was she, neither was I. But it was honest, painfully honest. Page after page described lessons learned, mistakes acknowledged, regrets confronted, responsibilities accepted, no excuses, no manipulation, no requests, just accountability. When I finished reading, tears filled my eyes. Not because everything was fixed, because healing was finally real. Months later, Melissa and I continued rebuilding our relationship, slowly, carefully, patiently. The way trust is rebuilt. There were still boundaries, healthy boundaries, important boundaries. I would never return to living the way I had before. Never. And surprisingly, Melissa respected that. Perhaps because she finally understood that boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. Protections for relationships. Protections for dignity. Protections for peace. One evening, nearly 2 years after I left Ohio, I sat on the beach with Sophie. The sun was setting. The waves rolled in softly. And life felt good. Really good. Grandma. Yes, she smiled. You know what the funny part is? What? She pointed toward the ocean. The moving trucks weren't really the important part. I laughed. No, she shook her head. The important part was that you finally chose yourself. I looked out at the horizon, thinking about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the heartbreak, the fear, the courage, the leaving, the healing. And I realized she was right. The moving trucks were never the story. The story was about a woman who spent too many years believing love required self-sacrifice. A woman who finally learned that loving others should never require abandoning yourself. The greatest victory wasn't keeping the house. It wasn't proving ownership. It wasn't watching Melissa face consequences. The greatest victory was remembering my own worth, because the day I left wasn't the day I lost my family. It was the day I stopped losing myself. And once I found myself again, everything else finally had a chance to heal. Sometimes the people who love us the most are also the people who take us for granted, not because they are evil, not because they never cared, but because familiarity can slowly become entitlement if we aren't careful. This story is not really about a house. It is not about moving trucks. It is not about legal documents. It is about self-respect. It is about understanding that love and sacrifice are not the same thing. Many parents spend decades putting their children first. There is beauty in that. There is honor in that. But there must also be limits. Because when we teach people that our needs never matter, eventually some of them will believe it. Setting boundaries does not mean you love less. Sometimes it means you finally love yourself too. And for those who have made mistakes like Melissa, remember this growth begins the moment excuses end. Real healing starts when accountability begins. No family is perfect. No person is perfect. But honesty, humility, and effort can rebuild things that once seemed impossible to repair. Most importantly, never believe it is too late to start over. Whether you are 40, 60, or 80, you still deserve peace. You still deserve respect. You still deserve a life that feels like your own. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? What would you have done in Diane's situation? Please leave a comment below and share your perspective. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys of resilience, healing, and hope.